What's up, everybody? Chester Therapy Church Devotional Podcast. Thanks for joining us. We get started reading the Bible and discussing it. Mitch brings us in. See you in a second.
Gives me grace for every trial. Feeds me with the living bread.
All right, Matt. Genesis chapter 9 is where we are this morning. Genesis 9, beginning in verse 12. Here's the word of God. We read it, we discuss it. Verse 12 of Genesis 9. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all future generations. I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I form clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature. The bow will be in the clouds, and I will look at it and remember the permanent covenant between God and all the living creatures on the earth." And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and every creature on the earth." Now, of course, he's talking about the rainbow here, the sign of God's covenant with Adam. The covenant is a promise that God makes with Adam that never again will he destroy every living creature with water. The earth will never be flooded like that again, and no longer will they ever have to fear that God will destroy every living creature through the flooding of the earth. And so God makes this promise. Adam believes God, and the sign of the promise is a rainbow in the sky. And God says, when I see the rainbow, I'll remember it. When you see the rainbow, you remember it. We remember, and this is the beauty of a covenant promise and a covenant sign, we remember God's faithfulness and his promise to us. God always keeps his word, and so we think about baptism as a covenant sign. We always remember when we think about baptism, we think about our own baptism, we see the baptism of other children or other professing believers, we are reminded of the fact that God indeed is faithful to fulfill his covenant promises to his people. When we look up into the sky after a rain and the light hits the droplets of the water in such a way they become a prism and we see the beauty of the rainbow, we're reminded that God indeed has made a promise to his people that he will never again destroy the earth through a flood, the way that he did during the days of Noah. It's interesting to me that this same imagery pops up later on in the book of Revelation when we see God sitting upon his throne, and surrounding the throne of God is a rainbow, as it were. And so it's as if God is viewing the world through the prism of that rainbow, or through the lens of that rainbow, that promise of life everlasting, that promise of life and the preservation of life. I think it's just a wonderful thing. And so when we think about it in our modern day, obviously the rainbow has been taken over by the LGBTQ plus community as a sign of their pride and of their lifestyle. But the reality of it is that that is not a sign of sinful pride. Rather, it's a sign of a covenant promise from God to his people that he will always provide and always care for his people. And so we need to understand that when we see a rainbow, we see God's promise to us as we recognize that he will never again destroy the earth through a flood. Now, he will bring judgment, and that judgment will come upon the earth, and those who refuse to walk with him will be carried off into captivity and enslaved for all eternity in the prison of hell. But those who walk with the Lord will find the hope of everlasting life. And so when we think about the beauty and the wonder of the rainbow, we think about the covenant sign that God has made a covenant with his people, and God is always faithful to fulfill that covenant. So verse 14 says again, "Whenever I form clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature." And so it's a covenantal promise of God. It's a sign of a covenantal promise of God that God will indeed never destroy the earth by the flood again, and that he will judge, but the judgment will not come in total destruction through the rising of water. We know that God keeps his promises because God is faithful to do that. So let me just encourage you guys with that today. As you think about God and his grace, think about what he does and his faithfulness to fulfill his promises. Know that the signs of the covenant are there and that God always fulfills the promises he makes, and the promise he makes here is a promise of life everlasting for those who would walk in him. You guys take care. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.
You care. your heart.